Hi. Before going to video, please subscribe to my channel for more interesting stuff. And the question is,
Serious, have to ever witnesses someone die? If so, what happened? I was with my dad when passed from a brain tumor. He took a deep gasp/breath and his coloring changed instantly to a grayish tone, then he was gone. I'm sorry for your loss of your dad. Yeah, I know the color, except he was that color for weeks. Had a dryness but waxiness to his skin, his eyes were dull. Mine died pneumonia/dementia. I was lucky not to be there when he died, but I was there a few hours before his did. The gasping. I was sitting in an open street shopping mall in Alice Springs waiting for a bus to Brisbane, because, fuck yay, when an elderly Aboriginal man approached me. I removed my headphones and heard him ask me, "You got a smoke brew?" I flashed a quick smile and offered him a couple from my open packet, and he grabbed two. He smiled back at me, said thank you and turned to walk away. I put my headphones back in and went back to reading a magazine when I saw all this commotion around the mall. I stood up to see what's going on, and there's old mate, face down on the concrete. Apparently he just dropped dead. Didn't even light the cigarette. I felt kinda weird while I sat there with his people, but they were cool as shit and didn't give me a hard time. I was with my dad when he died from malignant melanoma. He was moaning while unconscious because he was in pain. The nurse gave him his final morphine injection. Me and Mum sat with him. Then some kids outside were playing football on the grass. At the hospice, I was so freaked out that it would be the last thing he heard, so I rushed to close the window. He more than likely heard me flustering about the kids though. I got back to hold his hand and he just stopped breathing. No big gasp, he just stopped. It was horrible. My mum just wailed, "My Peter, my Peter." I felt like I shouldn't be there, so I left to tell the nurses. It was also surreal. I still hear his moans of pain. I used to work as a psychiatric care tech for a state mental hospital. We were extremely limited in the amount of care we could provide to profoundly physically ill patients, so we would occasionally get assigned to a patient who was at an actual local hospital. This was called a hospital vigil, and our only task was to ensure the patient's safety, since they were technically the state's responsibility. So we didn't provide any care, except talking with the patient, communicating with the nurses, and just making sure nothing hinky was going on. My third year, I was assigned a patient whose diagnosis was a personality disordered couple with extreme anorexia. She was approximately 50 and her body was absolutely destroyed by a lifetime of losing the fight against her eating disorder. Toward the end, her digestive system was so fucked they were pumping feces out of her stomach. She was also attached to a bunch of other machines, including a ventilator. She was not leaving the hospital alive. Her adult children were no longer in contact with her, and her husband had divorced her many years prior. She had no visitors. She eventually lost the ability to speak, especially with all the breathing machines, so we worked out a series of hand gestures to help with communication. Holding up one finger meant whiteboard, which she would use to write out more complicated requests. Holding up two fingers meant she was in some sort of respiratory distress, which meant we needed to alert the nurse. Holding up three fingers meant I'm afraid, or having an anxiety or panic attack. She rarely used three fingers. We had grown quite close since I was assigned vigil duty 5 or 6 nights out of a 6-day work week. This is probably because I never complained about it. There are very strict rules when it comes to what my employer considered fraternization. However, I believe that every patient deserved to be treated like a human being. I have had my share of troubles, and had a there but by the grace of God go type attitude. We played cards, we chatted, and we may have even played a few games of hangman/tic-tac-toe on her whiteboard. After 2 or so months, her body finally shut down. I was there when she died. She showed me 3 fingers, which meant she was scared, so I just held her hand and gave it a soft squeeze. I told her she wasn't alone, so she didn't need to be afraid. And she just kinda slipped away. The hand I wasn't holding still had 3 fingers up. Several nurses and a doctor were soon surrounding her body, and they dismissed me. I called my supervisor, to make sure I followed protocol. And that was it. Later that week, I got a written warning for holding the hand of a terrified dying woman. A nurse reported me for unprofessional behavior. Yeah, this happened at the end of January. My younger brother died of cancer while I was with him. He had a lot of problems, including substance abuse, so it wasn't really all that surprising that he would die first. I had been sensing that it would come for a few years, so that when we heard the diagnosis I was sad but not surprised. Yeah, this happened at the end of January. My younger brother died of cancer while I was with him. He had a lot of problems, including substance abuse, so it wasn't really all that surprising that he would die first. I had been sensing that it would come for a few years, so that when we heard the diagnosis I was sad but not surprised. I'm glad I was with him. I'm his big sister and he always looked to me to take care of him. I wasn't there when my dad passed overnight, but we took turns keeping vigil in his last week. It was awful seeing him decline. The cancer had spread to his brain and he had meningitis. Basically he couldn't even speak to us anymore, he was just in so much pain. He'd often convulse and groan. But sometimes he'd squeeze my hand. The night before he passed we were planning on taking him home for hospice. I remember crying when we made the decision to not resuscitate him. I remember whispering in his ear, "I love you. Don't be afraid. I will take care of the family, you have nothing to worry about." I wanted him to go peacefully and without worrying. Everyone, his doctors and my family, thought he'd have maybe another several days left or even a week or two. I even asked my husband for his professional opinion and he said probably a week. But I had a strange feeling it'd be sooner rather than later. The next morning at 6 a.m. I got the call that he had passed. He chose a moment in the 6 hours that my mom and I weren't there. We had taken turns for a whole week and that night my uncle was the one keeping vigil. I just had a feeling that was because my daddy didn't want us to see him go, that it would be too painful. My uncle said it was very peaceful, he just stopped breathing. You sometimes hear a last breath, but that's just the rest of the gas escaping. I rushed to the hospital, over an hour away from my home, and my family who had gotten there earlier had spent the entire time holding and rubbing his hand to keep it warm for me. I got to hold his hand one last time. My grandpa was holding his mouth together, but my dad looked like he was smiling, like he was having a nice dream and didn't have a care in the world. I hadn't seen that in a long time. Ever since he became sick, his resting face was always a wince from the pain that not even morphine could take away. I watched my cousin's dog get hit by a car when I was 7 or 8. My cousin, 6 or 7, and I were biking up their long dirt driveway to the dirt road that continued past their house, and the dog was following us. We stopped at the intersection and the dog was walking at the edge of the road. We beckoned for him to come back onto the driveway when a blue vehicle, probably a late 90s or early 2000s Suburban, sped past, probably going over the speed limit, and launched the dog into the air. I presume he was hit on the head and shoulders. He landed with a solid thud on the ground in front of us, shaking, but otherwise not moving. We didn't know what to do, and we were desperately thinking about how we might possibly be able to save him when he stopped shaking. His tongue, which had been sticking out slightly since he landed, had turned gray. My cousin, with tears in her eyes, yelled, "Go get my mom." So I grabbed my bike and biked as fast as I possibly could back to the house, where I started screaming, "Auntie! Auntie! Vegas, the dog, got hit by a car." Through tears. At this point everyone who was home was crying. We called my uncle and told him what happened since he was at work at the time. When he got home he gently picked up Vegas and brought him to the corner of a tree line and some grass fields. He buried him, gathered us, and we had a funeral for him. My dad heard about this event and bought a small chunk of rock from a custom masonry company and had Vegas forever in our hearts engraved on it and placed it when he came to pick me up. Forgive me for the long story, but this is the first time been able to tell it in 15 years. In high school a classmate got hit by a car in front of the school. A buddy and I were waiting for the crosswalk light when a guy we both knew, but weren't really friends with, ran by us, crossing against the light, and was hit by a car trying to beat the yellow. He was wearing a Sony Walkman. Personal music devices were very new, that may have contributed to not noticing the speeding car. I heard a sickening crunch and looked over to see his body pinwheeling through the air and landing in a heap. The car kept going. I ran towards him. My buddy ran back to the school to call 911. Cell phones were still 10 years away. When I got to him I sorta cradled his head in my arms, embracing him protectively, but he was obviously extremely fucked up all over. He had landed head/face first from probably 15 in the air, and a big piece of skull/scalp/hair was flopped open like a trapdoor, exposing his brain. I kept trying to hold the trapdoor shut, but it was slippery with blood. I remember he had the bluest eyes I had ever seen on anyone, and he was looking right at me with a shocked and confused look on his face. He stared at me for about 30 seconds and then the life just seeped slowly out of him. No drama, no gasping for air, no calling for his mama, he just stopped being alive. It was like someone was slowly turning down a dimmer switch as his eyes went from piercing blue to light blue to dull gray blue. I think he bled out. It was the first dead person I had ever seen, and it struck me that when we are alive, we have limitless potential. When we are dead we are nothing, a bag of meat. The ambulance guys showed up and took him away. They didn't even try CPR, they knew he was past resuscitation. When they picked him up to put him on the gurney most of the back of his head fell off, His skull was shattered. After they left, I noticed the kid's sneakers were still on the road in the crosswalk in the exact position he had been in when he had been hit. The car had knocked the kid right out of his shoes. They weren't even tipped over. That was the 80s, so there was no counseling or PTSD considerations, and it never really affected me. Didn't think or talk much about it. Then about 10 years later, I was watching an episode of Star Trek TNG with my GF, and there was a scene where LaForge opens a trapdoor on Data's head and folds back the hair, and I came unglued. My mom. She had COPD. She was in intensive care. They kept trying to get her to take a breathing device that would basically force air down your throat and be sucked to your face. She kicked and punched the doctors away. She knew she was dying and had been in pain for a really long time. The worst was when I took my hand out from hers for a second. And I mean a second. Her hand was indented from where mine was. It was like her hand was casting around mine. This point there were no machines and she was pretty close to being gone, obviously. Her hand was only warm cause I was holding it. I was 27. It messes me up sometimes, but holy hell, I wouldn't have ever not been beside that woman as she passed. My dad passed in hospital when I was 24 and that really sucked. I wasn't there. She would have literally killed for us, and she was an amazing woman. I'm happy out of all the moms she was mine. Another not so great one, best friend's dad's suicide. Hanging from the clothing pole in a closet. What always sticks with me is if he really wanted to he could have stood up. Like he hung himself almost on his knees. Her boyfriend had to cut him down. We were 19. I was the only person to speak at his funeral, as requested by my best friend. I'm glad I got to do that. But I was there when he passed as well. My mom and him were pretty close friends. I miss them all. Didn't see it happen but saw the aftermath. Was working as a bus monitor. We had a student we dropped off in some apartments on the sketchy side of town. We get to the apartments and there's a bunch of cops out front, people walking all around the place. It was a kinda chaotic scene. We rounded the corner and I see the woman collapse into another woman's arms, sobbing her eyes out. I could just tell, someone had been killed. I began to shift my eyes left and right, watching for anything that could possibly be a threat to the bus when a horrible thought hit me. What if it's the kid's mom? My heart was racing as we made the next turn, just before getting to his apartment building, afraid we'd be greeted by a police officer. Fortunately, Mom came out looking pretty shaken. The driver asked what happened and she told us that some kid had been shot and killed. She didn't know much else, just that he was 17 and had been shot several times. We dropped off the student and told her to stay safe before we left. As we made the next couple of turns, he was at the back of the apartments, so we had to go all the way around. I kept scanning, just keeping an eye on things. I looked down a dark corridor and suddenly it was full of light, just for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction of a second I could see a body with a tarp over it, and several little pyramids. I happened to look just as they were taking a photo of the scene. It's an image burned into my memory. All I could think of was, that is a 17-year-old kid under there just gone. It broke my heart. We learned later that he was friends with another kid that pissed off some kids in a gang. I can't remember if he was with the friend, confuses for the friend, or targeted because he was friends with the kid, but, whatever it was, some members of the gang came and shot him 7 times. Only thing he did wrong was be friends with someone. Fucking shame. Me and my friend were on the bus and he started talking about a website with these freaky videos and you had to try and not get grossed out or scared or give up for as long as you can. We were on the 5th video, and when it starts, it's filmed by a camera in the top corner of the room, pointed at a bathtub. It was of an escape artist who has tied herself up with her legs above her hands behind her legs, and her head underwater. She finishes tying a knot, and begins trying to slip out of the ropes. She moves around like she's trying to attempt something she saw in a video. The ropes don't budge. She tries grabbing the knots near her hands, but the ropes are too tight for her to reach. Her movements get more and more erratic to the point where it seems like her thrashing might hurt her. After about a minute, she suddenly just stops. Me and my friend look at each other with surprise on both our faces. I was the first to say anything. I literally just said, "Holy fuck." I was 19 when I held my dad's hand in a hospital room as he passed from brain met secondary to lung cancer. The room was filled with family members wailing and sobbing, and all I can remember is holding his hand and thinking how warm it was, and that it was the last time I would ever be able to do so. I remember thinking that I hoped he couldn't hear his family grieving as the last thing he'd ever hear, so I leaned close and just whispered random stuff to him in his ear, stuff like memories of my childhood, that I was here and wouldn't leave him, that my brother was on his way, that he could let go if he needed to, it was okay and we'd all be fine. He was chain-stokes breathing, very irregular drawn-out long shuddering breaths, with a kind of moan as he exhaled. His breaths gradually got further and further apart until he just didn't draw the next one. I was 23 when I held my micro-preemie son as he passed away. He made one tiny squeak as he was born and then was just completely silent and still for the next 2 hours that it took him to die. The nurses, bless their souls, came in occasionally to place a warm stethoscope on his chest to see if his heart was still beating, and then would leave us alone to bear witness with him as a family. My mother and partner were the only other people in the room. We each had a chance to hold him, and when he finally passed I was the one holding him. His was a very quiet, peaceful death, no wailing or sobbing, just quiet love. I used to be a security guard supervisor at a hospital. We were around death a lot since it was our job to take bodies to and release bodies from the morgue, but only once did I witness somebody dying before my eyes. We got a call one night for a security assist. They were usually called when a high-risk patient was becoming violent or trying to leave. That night the patient was a meth addict that had been brought to the ICU for one reason or another, and he was lashing out from withdrawal and swinging punches at the nurses. My officers and I got into the room and managed to gain control of the patient and started putting on restraints with the help of the nurses. We had just finished putting the restraints on and had stepped out of the room when a nurse exclaimed that the guy had started coding and we needed to get the restraints off right away. So we quickly worked to undo the restraints and stepped outside the room again while the doctor and nurses started trying to revive him. I stood there for a good half hour and watched all the urgency gradually slow down as the nurses realized that all hope had run out. The doctor threw his gloves in the trash in frustration. The man I had just seen thrashing around and shouting a short time ago was now dead. The darkest part of the whole situation may be the man's last words. Just before he started coding, I heard the man tell a nurse he had to pee. That was the last thing he said. His family members showed up afterwards and I felt sick knowing that the last words of their loved one were so undignified. I obviously didn't dare tell them that, but it was one of many moments in my tenure in security that made me realize just how messy and insignificant life can be.
Thanks for watching. Please do like, share, comment and subscribe for more videos.